England, and I pointed this out to him, that it was his own suicide. He had more to lose than I had. And his argument was that, well, the Americans do it, why shouldn't the British do it? And he was actually unable to see that it was his own suicide. But I did also meet a gentleman from the Dunlop Rubber Company, and Dunlop has been very important transferring rubber tire technology to the Soviet Union, who admitted that so far as that area is concerned, I was exactly correct. In fact, I hadn't got all of it. But he said, well, even if it is my own suicide, I will continue to do it because it's business. And I had no answer to that one. So what I'm saying is that, in brief, all Western technology, all Soviet technology from 1917 right down to the present day comes from the West. And this is based on a very precise technical analysis. It's technical. I look at engines and machines, and I look at specifications. It's not something I imagined. I've been at this thing over a decade and a half, and no one yet has proven me wrong on a technical factor. And this is approximately the position today, except that under Kissinger, the Soviets have been able to achieve a fundamentally new technological horizon, of course, with a financial subsidy, because they're getting loans at 6% when you have to pay 10 and 12% with a financial subsidy from the United States. Now, the big problem that I had in the early 1970s was that this was not the whole story. There were at least two remaining problems. One, we were building up Soviet military capability, and there were indications, and I was a little unsure about this in 1970, that this was a deliberate policy on the part of the United States. I called it the X factor. I spotted it perhaps as early as the late 1960s that there was something operating there to enable these massive transfers to continue over a period of decades. And any time you pointed it out, you were immediately slapped down. There was some kind of behind-the-scenes pressure making for these massive transfers. Now, the most important problem that I saw was the military transfer problem. So I'm sure some of you know I went to Miami Beach in 1972. I attempted to point this out to the Republican Party, and what I got was outright hostility. These are things we just don't talk about. Looking at the Wall Street Journal last week and noting that Arm & Hammer gave the Republicans $100,000 in 1972, I can see that I wasn't playing the right game. I certainly didn't give them anything like $100,000. Now, to summarize the National Suicide Book, there is no question in my mind that Soviet military capability essentially depends on Western technology. But there is one exception I would point out, that you do not need a free enterprise system to develop military technology, because the military work in a rather different way to an industrialist. The military say, well, this is the next specification we want. They set up a specification and they work towards it, and cost is no object. But within, of course, industry, cost is very much part of your objective. You've got to be competitive. And so what the Soviets have been very successful in doing is setting up a very adequate, a very sensible design, military design specifications, and using Western technology to work towards it and do it quite capably. So I'm quite sure that aircraft with our assistance and their ships and their guns are quite effective. To give you some examples, American pilots were coming back during the Vietnam War, and they were saying, well, that's funny because those trucks on the Ho Chi Minh Trail look like Ford trucks. Well, they were Ford trucks because half of them were coming from the Gorky plant, which was built by the Ford Motor Company. And you've got the MiGs over Korea, which I pointed out earlier, had Rolls-Royce engines, and Rolls-Royce and some of the German designs, BMW, have been the basis of a Russian jet development. So that is approximately the story. What we need today is research to fill out the gaps in our knowledge of the loss of American independence. And there are two major areas which I suggest need study in depth. One is the Federal Reserve System, particularly the political role of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York from 1913 up to today. Clearly, the Federal Reserve System controls money supply, and therefore is a very important, if not a dominant factor, in what happens in the economy. This whole attempt to replace gold with artificial fiat money is part of this whole problem that I think has to be investigated. But up to the moment, we can't even get an audit of the Federal Reserve System. The second area, which I think needs to be investigated, is the Council on Foreign Relations. I don't have that much evidence myself, but a number of people I respect have, well, a great number of people I respect have pointed out that members of this particular council turn up in a number of key places on a very regular basis. I suspect that one can dismiss 90% of them as being academic hangers-on or social climbers, but there's a core in there which probably well warrants investigation. I can tell you this much. Certainly in the 1920s, where the State Department files are open, there is very clear evidence that members of the Council on Foreign Relations were fundamental in achieving a pro-Soviet policy and building up the Soviet Union. Gerard Swope, for example, was most certainly a member. So given the state of our knowledge today, I think we can say the following. The constitutional independence of the United States has been abandoned. Further, there has been a knowledgeable and deliberate effort to build the Soviet Union into a formidable enemy, in spite of the fact of 2 wars in which 100,000 Americans and countless allies have been killed. I suggest that there is a knowledgeable and deliberate effort to submerge U.S. independence into a web of economic and financial relationships with a totalitarian dictatorship. And this is in large part concealed from the American public. To go back to my earlier example, the truth is at the 3rd level, and the statements coming out are all at the 1st level. On the other hand, these policies, as from where I stand, are not too well thought out in detail. There was a Foreign Affairs article in April 1974 entitled, I quote, "The Hard Road to a New World Order." And it pointed out the problems with using the United Nations as a vehicle to achieve a socialist world state. And I suspect that the problems of creating a socialist world order are increasing and are somewhat greater than anticipated by the world planners. Some of the more important problems that I can glean from sources like Foreign Affairs would certainly be the United Nations. I suggest that the concept of United Nations as the global authority may have been abandoned, and that the emphasis is going to be on regional planning, on regional management. The vehicles will be such things as world environment, commodities, food supply, population, that kind of thing. It's a more roundabout way to get the same objective. What I suggest the process would be to build larger pieces first and then weld these larger pieces together. We can observe a major effort to substitute SDR's, special drawing rights, paper money, for gold. These are going to be an engine of international inflation in the same way the Federal Reserve System has been an engine of domestic inflation. But historically, these attempts to use paper money have always collapsed. And I see no reason, technically, why the SDR effort should succeed. On the other hand, you cannot achieve a world order with hard gold currency, because the politicians cannot print numbers on gold. They can print all the numbers they want on pieces of paper. So, as I see it, from my viewpoint, the world planners have got to impose a paper money system as part of their move towards what they call a new world order. The third problem, which may not sound